I'm going to set the scene and put this area of DNA testing in context. And DNA testing is absolutely on the rise, and you can see just how increased, how many people are getting testing. I couldn't get a more recent slide than that, but it would be through the roof. The issue first came to attention in terms of academic research to this paper by Sonia Allen and Damien Adams, but it was in a fairly sort of little known adoption journal, and so it didn't really sort of come to the attention of many health professionals in the ART area, and so it sort of went under the radar a bit until this seminal paper came out in Human Reproduction, and so it really caused people to sit up and take notice. Then we started to see media articles coming to the fore, and now we see them on virtually a daily basis. Louise just mentioned some information on our website, and so we also decided that we needed to put some information there because it was affecting so many of our stakeholders. I also wanted to share with you some very recent results from the We Are Donor Conceived group, and they surveyed 312 donor conceived people, and the results are really quite startling when you see that 37% have discovered that they were donor conceived from a DNA test. So these are not isolated events, they're happening all the time. Also, when you see people finding genetic connections and finding their donor, 55% of people surveyed found their donor through DNA testing. So this is something that's really taken off. So I'm now going to pass over to Professor David Amor. He's a specialist in genetics, and he will give you some groundwork so that you understand the basics of DNA testing. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think I'm going to be the technical component, and for those of you who are feeling nervous, I promise to be brief because I've heard the talks before that you're going to hear tonight, and they are extremely compelling and worth listening to. But I just want to give a little bit of background in terms of how the genetic testing actually works, because genetic testing has become so omnipresent in our culture and society, but of course it doesn't all come in one flavour. There's lots of different types of genetic tests. But what we're talking about tonight is specifically genealogical genetic testing, and that comes in three main varieties, and I'll just speak to you briefly about those and how they work. You can see here a bit of I just put a screenshot on the right-hand side of some of the different companies that provide genetic testing, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to lump them all together because all of them are essentially using similar technology. So just briefly, the two more old-fashioned, shall we say, types of genetic testing are those related to Y chromosome inheritance and mitochondrial inheritance. So each of those has been around for about 20 years or so. They were the first ancestry or genealogically based genetic testing, but they're not really useful in terms of finding your relatives within on a scale of the last couple of hundred years. If you want to find out what sort of population you were descended from tens of thousands of years ago, they may be quite useful. But basically, the thing to remember is that if we're talking about Y chromosome testing, the Y chromosome only comes from your father. So this is the way to find your father's 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 father. But of course, all the other bits in between are not revealed. So it's not particularly useful for finding your relatives. The second type is it's kind of the female equivalent. It's the mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is inherited by everyone, but only ever from their mother. So if you find a certain mitochondrial DNA signature in any individual, that comes from their mother and from their mother's mother, etc. And so these are the sort of testing that you might read about in a paper where someone's traced a population group back 50,000 years to prehistory, but as I said, not particularly useful in most instances for tracking down your relatives. So what really changed everything was the advent of what's called autosomal genetic testing. So this is testing not of the X chromosome or the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA, but testing of all the different chromosomes. And the technology that's used is this thing which sometimes we call a gene chip or a microarray, and this is a relatively cheap way of putting about 500,000 individual DNA spots on a glass slide, and that allows us to get a unique DNA fingerprint from each individual. And without going into too much detail, what we're interested in is these things called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And these are points in the genome which differ between different people. So everyone has their own unique SNP profile. So this sort of testing these days costs sort of $50 to $100 in terms of consumables, and if we run this test, we can generate, as I said, a unique genetic profile for each individual, and then that can be compared with other individuals. And if it's a genealogical genetic test, that means other individuals in the databases of the company to which you send the particular test. And you might say, well, that's pretty unlikely that the company will have someone else that's a relative, but in fact that increasingly is not the case, and it's estimated that within the next 5 years, over 95% of people who have this test will have a relative of theirs who has already been tested by the companies, and you saw the stats that Kate put up before. So what can this be used for? Well, firstly, this can identify relatives. It can identify people who you are related to, and it can do that fairly reliably up to about your third cousin. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, I have no idea who my third cousins are. I kind of know my first cousins, and my second cousins, I might recognise a few names, and my third cousins, I couldn't name one. But it's reasonably reliable up until that point. It rapidly loses reliability beyond the third cousin. And the reason for that is that for your fourth cousin, it may turn out just by chance you don't share any DNA with them at all. So you're genetic relatives, but in fact, you're not genetic relatives. You have completely separate genomes. But up to third cousins, it can be quite useful. Well, it can be quite accurate. Secondly, it can reveal some information about your ethnic origins, and you will have seen this information that says someone is 50% European and 20% South Asian, etc. That's fairly crude, I would say, and there's a bit of a risk when we look at that data that we think that ethnicity is entirely genetically based, which of course it's not. But it's recreational genetics, so it's kind of a bit of fun. And thirdly, this sort of testing can reveal some information about risks for common diseases. So for some companies, they will provide health information. It's not going to tell you if you have a rare disease, but the data can be used to give information about whether you are at higher than average risk or lower than average risk of a whole range of health problems, which might be ischemic heart disease or diabetes or obesity, for example. What this data cannot do is it cannot tell how someone is related to you, okay? So a grandparent would look the same as an uncle or an aunt, so it can't say this person is your great-grandfather, or it can say that you share a certain amount of DNA, so you're approximately a second-degree relative or a third-degree relative. That is without the help of pedigree information or family trees. Once you have a family tree and you might know something about the family, you can piece things together. As I mentioned, it cannot reliably detect distant relatives. And finally, in terms of health information, this does not test for rare genetic diseases, okay? So if we take the example of something like breast cancer, it might be able to say that your risk of breast cancer is a bit higher than average or a bit lower than average, but it's not going to say you have a high penetrance breast cancer gene, like a BRCA1 gene, for example, because those are rare mutations, and what we are testing for is common variation between different people. So that is it.